Saint Elsewhere was a critically acclaimed television drama that aired throughout most of the 1980s, and in the final episode, it was revealed that the entire series had been taking place in the mind of an autistic child. And spoilers for the following Scooby-Doo episodes. Velma's Uncle Dave is a federal patrol officer stationed near a reservation next to the Canadian border. After he fails to meet them in town, the gang take a boat to his cabin across the bay, only to be attacked by a huge owl-like creature, which they later learn may be the willowa, a flying monster feared by the local Native American tribe. According to legend, if an owl calls your name, the willowa is coming for you.
Called your name.
It's never explained how or why this owl says Scooby's name, which means this could have been an actual warning that he is doomed to be taken by the real willowa and not the disguise used by this episode's villains. Good thing the gang presumably left the area after the unmasking before that could happen.
Maybe we should turn back until it blows over. We can't. I'm worried about Uncle Dave.
The Scooby-Doo Show's second season began with the gang looking for Velma's missing Uncle John, while this, the first episode of the third season, begins with them looking for Velma's missing Uncle Dave. Funny enough, as I mentioned in my video on that earlier episode, I have an Uncle John in real life. I also have an Uncle Dave in real life. And like the former, I wouldn't care that much if I never saw the latter again either. Gray Fox, a member of the local Chippewa community, along with two other tribesmen acting as his henchmen, ran a smuggling operation into Canada from their reservation. Taking advantage of tribal folklore, the three men disguised a jet-powered balloon as the willowa, a huge, glowing owl-like monster. Gray Fox would fly the balloon, while the other two dressed as Owlmen to carry out his orders, such as kidnapping Velma's uncle or scaring off trespassers.
What was that?
A monster!
While I'm happy they didn't call it a ghost for a change, this is one of those times where what they see could actually be a spirit, considering it glows and flies.
I am Red Heron, Sachem of the Chippewa, and a friend of your uncle.
Red Heron identifies himself as a Sachem in his language, which we would think of as chief. While Sachem is an Algonquin word, the Chippewa are Central Algonquin, and in their language, he would have been called an Ogama. Admittedly, I'm not a scholar of Native American languages, so I could be wrong, but that's what I was able to find online. The only reason I was paying so much attention to this was because Adobe Premiere's transcribe feature thought Red Heron was calling himself Soccer Mother. And that is just glorious. I would love to see this guy hauling around a bunch of kids in a minivan and standing alongside a field, gossiping with a bunch of 30-something suburban white women.
When owl calls your name, willowa swoops out of skies to carry you away.
This is not the first time in the franchise that a Native American legend of a flying, glowing animal appears. At least this time, it was actual Native Americans using their own legend. So while the willowa story gets no points for originality, it didn't include cultural appropriation.
And look at all this other neat stuff. Paintings, hi-fis, silver, statues.
Instead of gold, jewelry, or livestock, Gray Fox and his men were smuggling stolen consumer goods. This makes it very difficult to determine the value of the scheme. However, it's probably safe to say that if what we saw on screen is typical of the goods being moved, it may not have been that valuable.
Scooby, where are you?
Why was there an Academy Award there? At the time, those televisions sold for around $400 to $500 each, while the most expensive average consumer stereo system would sell for no more than $1,000. If sold brand new, there is less than $5,000 worth of electronics in that cave. As these were not in their original packaging and clearly secondhand merchandise, it's unlikely a legitimate seller would pay wholesale cost, leaving just the more questionable merchants like pawn shops as viable options. As fenced goods, television and stereo equipment would likely command no more than 10 or 20% of their retail value, making what's in that cave worth maybe $1,000, or around $5,000 in today's money. The value of the artwork is even more difficult to pin down. It appears to consist of mostly landscape paintings with a couple of cityscapes tossed in. This is not meant to disparage artists who do this, but what we saw here looks more like the kind of work produced for flea markets or general sale to businesses that need something cheap to decorate their walls. If that was the case, an anonymous artist would be lucky to get even $20 at the time for their work, which would put the combined value of the paintings at less than a few $100s. The statues appear to run the gamut of any number of styles and origins, from Greco-Roman to Egyptian, and even African or South American. While it's possible these could have been looted from a museum and were extremely valuable, it's also just as likely that they were mere reproductions and meant to cheaply decorate a dentist's office somewhere. This would again imply their combined value at just a few $100s. Scooby's dressing as a girl again. About the only objects of actual tangible value we saw would be the rack of fur coats and the silver collection. And even those could be fakes. If legitimate mink, what Scooby is so casually dancing around in could have sold for up to $10,000 at the time. That's $50,000 in today's money. If the 5 coats seen here were all legitimate mink, we're talking around $50,000 total in 1978, or $250,000 in 2024. But again, that's assuming they would sell at top dollar. As stolen merchandise, that's unlikely. At best, thieves could expect around $1,000 total for all 5 coats. The silver, meanwhile, is equally hard to value. Historic prices are difficult to determine, but today, a sterling silver tea set could cost anywhere from $1,000 to several $1,000s. If demand was the same back in the late 1970s, that would be just a couple of hundred up to $1,000 per set. And that's not considering if the items were pure silver or merely silver-plated. There's also no convenient way to price the trophies or candlesticks, but it's unlikely they'd exceed more than a few $100s each. Those values take into account the craftsmanship. Thieves have been known to steal objects comprised of precious metals only to melt them down to sell the raw materials. At the time, silver was worth a little over $5 per ounce, so a ton of the metal would be worth around $160,000. Even if we assume everything shown here was solid silver, there's nowhere near a ton of material. If we're being extremely generous, there could be maybe $5,000 worth of silver in that cave. When totaled up, the entirety of the stolen merchandise is worth well under $10,000, or around $50,000 in today's money. If you feel I'm being too stingy when it comes to valuing the paintings and statues, remember everything else we saw, the TVs, stereo equipment, fur coats, and silverware, point to consumer products, not museum-quality artwork. This would imply the paintings and statues are the same, and thus not worth that much money. We never saw Gray Fox or his accomplices selling any of the merchandise, nor the means by which they would. They don't run a storefront or a pawn shop. They don't even seem to have a van from which they could sell their items in a back alley somewhere. This means they were likely just one link of the chain of stolen goods being smuggled into Canada, which would then imply they were merely getting a small cut of those $10,000. Obviously, we only saw what's essentially a snapshot of the contraband Gray Fox and his crew had at the time the Scooby Gang got involved. It's possible that they had already offloaded a large amount of stolen goods, and what we saw in the episode just happened to be a few leftovers that wouldn't fit on the vehicle they used to transport their loot. But I feel confident with my assertion that this was not a particularly valuable smuggling operation. But did it have to be? Usually with my design analysis of a Scooby villain, I like to weigh the rewards of their scheme with the risks involved with carrying it out. Generally speaking, the bad guys get a lower score if the potential to get caught or the punishment they face was much higher than the value of their crime. So what were the risks to Gray Fox and his 2 henchmen?
Willowa will never fly again. Council of Elders will punish those who bring shame on tribe.
Federally recognized Native American reservations do have some degree of autonomy, and small crimes committed within their jurisdiction are handled within the tribe. Major crimes, however, are usually prosecuted by federal authorities. Gray Fox and his accomplices were caught smuggling contraband across an international border, so it's unlikely the United States or Canada would allow for their punishment to be decided solely by Chippewa tribal elders. However, going by what we saw in the episode, Red Heron seems to have been allowed to take the captured men without Uncle Dave putting up any form of protest. This was either due to the Chippewa tribal elders actually having jurisdiction, or that it would only be a matter of time before the federal government took the 3 men into custody. It's possible Gray Fox felt such a paltry scheme was worth the risk of getting caught, as he only risked whatever punishment might be doled out by his tribal elders. If so, he greatly underestimated the danger to his freedom. Native American reservations do have a justice system not too dissimilar to the rest of the country, including jail cells for petty misdemeanors. For everything else, they routinely extradite criminals to federal prison to serve their sentences. No matter what, Gray Fox and his accomplices were looking at a long stretch behind bars if caught. There's no way to justify this smuggling operation was worth it. The willowa and the Owlman get a 1 out of 5 for their design. Between the main villain, the willowa, and his henchman, the Owlman, we're looking at 2 sets of disguises this time around. As mentioned, the concept of the willowa is just a recycled version of Tamuka the Ghost Bull, a giant animal flying through the sky based on a Native American legend. This time around, though, the flying creature was based on an animal that could actually fly, and the glowing effect was much more consistent. That's pretty much it for any special effects. Though they do mention the sound made by the willowa, that was just the jet engine powering the craft.
Rudy, what's wrong? Excuse me.
My first thought seeing this was how cruel Shaggy was to that fish. It wouldn't be able to survive very long in that glass of water, and I wondered how long they had to replenish the fish bowl. Turns out goldfish can actually survive months in low oxygen conditions due to a quirk of their physiology that allows them to produce ethanol when oxygen levels of their water are depleted. It was still a dick move on Shaggy's part, and we can only hope Uncle Dave sees what happened after he's rescued later and refills the bowl. Also, despite how often they're shown on cartoons, apparently fish bowls are not the best way to keep goldfish, as they put a lot of stress on their bodies.
Sounds like,
Howling? How? Owl?
Yeah.
Wait a minute. Why is Scooby using charades? He can talk. That's kind of his thing.
Come on, owls don't grow that big.
Not even 10 minutes earlier, you were attacked on your boat by a giant owl thing, Velma. Stop trying to gaslight Scooby.
He must have seen something. Let's take a look.
Thank you, Fred. I'm glad after almost a decade, somebody is finally learning to take Scooby seriously when he says he saw something scary. The Owlman, by contrast, had zero special effects or anything that would sell their supposedly supernatural nature. Nothing that would make them anything other than 2 guys wearing costumes. At least the pterodactyl ghost could fly. Kind of. This further emphasizes something about both the willowa and the Owlman. None of them were scary. The only thing they had going for them was the physical size of their get-ups. The willowa wasn't much different than an airplane buzzing you, while the 2 Owlmen wouldn't be out of place at a furry convention. Though to some people that in itself could be very disturbing.
What's wrong?
The Owlman Scooby saw, they're right behind us.
Gosh, Velma, I thought owls didn't grow that big. While the gang were shown running from the Owlmen, that's par for the course for the teenagers, as they usually run from the villains until their investigation is concluded and they're ready for the unmasking. In fact, the Owlmen were so unintimidating, Shaggy and Scooby dressed up in their suits just to screw around. This may be another one of those situations where your background determines how frightening a Scooby costume is going to be. Unless you grew up on the reservation where you were told frightening tales of the willowa, the average person isn't going to be nearly as scared off by one soaring through the sky. Speaking of which, much like the aforementioned pterodactyl ghost, Gray Fox was onto something with the willowa costume. With its maneuverability and relatively simple design, this would have made an excellent personal aircraft that they could have marketed to amateur pilots or thrill seekers. This is especially notable considering that the villains managed to somehow acquire a jet engine, something that ordinarily would have been extremely difficult and expensive to purchase. Then again, it's possible, or even probable, that they stole it or otherwise used their connections with the criminal underworld to procure it. The willowa and the Owlman not only weren't scary, but they were also somewhat bland for Scooby villains, though the willowa itself was well engineered and with sufficient special effects to sell the idea of an otherworldly flying monster. They get a 2 out of 5 for their outfit score. Right off the bat, Gray Fox and his henchmen made the mistake of kidnapping Velma's Uncle Dave. That by itself was the only reason the gang got involved in the first place. If they had waited until the border guard had met with his niece and her friends in town, then abducted him after they left, it would have gone a lot better for them.
Indian picture writing. When I was a little girl, Uncle Dave taught it to me. This is the sign for danger.
That's a human skull, Velma. I don't think it takes extensive knowledge in Native American languages to recognize that it means danger.
What's it doing here?
Uncle Dave knew we were coming. I'll bet he made it to warn us.
Uncle Dave spoke English and knew Velma and the rest did too. Why didn't he just write his warning in English? If he was afraid that the message would be intercepted by the bad guys and wanted to write in code, fine. Except he also knew the bad guys were Native American and would be able to understand the pictograph as well. There was no point in trying to be sneaky this way. While it's true Gray Fox and the others probably didn't know Uncle Dave was expecting guests, that just means the villains didn't do enough recon before bursting into his cabin and hauling him away. If they knew he was close to discovering their smuggling operation, you'd think they would have also found out his schedule for the foreseeable future and would have known there were more potential witnesses coming. Of course, where there's kidnapping, there's the question of what the bad guys were going to do with their victim. Gray Fox's scheme was ongoing and didn't appear as though they were planning on leaving the area after one big score. Instead, they seem to be maintaining a constant pipeline of stolen goods into Canada and presumably meant to continue indefinitely. This would imply that the bad guys needed to find a more permanent way of dealing with Uncle Dave. If that was their intention, what was the point of holding him captive in their cave hideout? If you're planning on making someone disappear, it's not a good idea to procrastinate, as every minute they're still alive means a chance for them to escape and ruin your operation. Then again, Uncle Dave was a border guard, so presumably he had supervisors he would normally report to. This means he wasn't the only one suspicious of the activity going on in the nearby Native American reservation. If he went missing, it would be obvious where the search for him would begin. Investigating his disappearance would involve federal law enforcement with far more resources to conduct a search than a simple local sheriff's office. We're never told what Gray Fox and the others did to arouse Uncle Dave's suspicions, but clearly they did something wrong, and thus their operation was already doomed long before Scooby and the rest arrived. By kidnapping Velma's uncle, all the bad guys did was get caught that much more quickly. They'd have been better off packing up the remaining contraband and leaving the country. Speaking of investigators, is it possible that the gang's involvement ruined the work of the legitimate authorities? As mentioned, it's unlikely that Gray Fox was the mastermind of the entire smuggling ring, but rather just one part of the chain that began in the United States and ended in Canada. Though Uncle Dave was in imminent danger after having been abducted, by capturing Gray Fox and his henchmen, the teenagers made it impossible for investigators to stake out the cave to trace the arrival of the stolen goods from this country or following them to their destination over the border.
Look! All those cans of kerosene.
And sandbags.
Sandbags. Quite a treasure you found there, Fred. Choosing a cave as their hideout was also a poor choice for the villains. Almost everything they were smuggling, clothing, electronics, and silver, was susceptible to damage by moisture. Being that close to the river, there's no way that cave was dry enough to make a suitable storage location, regardless of how little time the stolen goods were kept inside. The fur coats would mildew, the electronics would suffer rust and corrosion to their internal components, and the silver would tarnish badly. It was also questionable why they chose that cave in particular as their hideout. We've seen cave locations used by villains before, and even then they were often a dumb choice. But here, it was especially stupid, as instead of a nondescript cliffside hole or gap in the rocks, Gray Fox chose a glaringly obvious cave, decorated with pictographs that would naturally attract those interested in Native American history. Their choice of hideout and the need to frighten off the curious is what led them to concocting the entire willowa cover story in the first place, which ended up drawing even more attention to their scheme. If they had picked a different cave, or better yet, built a small cabin in the woods or any other location that wasn't so out in the open, they wouldn't have had to bother with flying monster balloons and owl costumes. Speaking of which, the Owlmen were also very sloppy when it came to their disguises, as they left them hanging up in the cave where anyone could find them and immediately ascertain they weren't real, thus ruining the entire willowa cover story. Gray Fox's operation is yet another example of how organized crime would answer all questions. Mob connections would explain how the stolen inventory was supplied to the Native American bad guys, as well as where they were heading into Canada. It would also explain how Gray Fox was able to get his hands on a jet engine in the first place, as a large criminal organization would have access to resources normally unavailable to common crooks. This would also make it worthwhile for Gray Fox and his henchmen to maintain their smuggling operation, with the implication that the paltry amount of goods in the cave represented just a very small part of the overall operation, with the lion's share of contraband already having been delivered to their criminal cohorts across the border. As there's no actual evidence of mob influence, the villains must be ranked on just what appears in the episode, and in this case, it's not very impressive. Gray Fox and his henchmen made mistake after mistake with practically no actions that would come close to affording them status as master criminals. They get a 2 out of 5 for their operation. The Birdmen deserve some credit for having been able to successfully smuggle enough items to arouse Uncle Dave's suspicions, but that's about it.
Scooby, are you all right?
All right.
It took Scooby over 6 seconds to fall. That means he had to have dropped about 600 feet, or little under half the height of the Empire State Building. He should not be all right. Ditto for Gray Fox in the balloon basket. The Willowa and his Owlman get a final due score of 1.7 out of 5.
Shaggy, I'll stay here at the cabin with the girls in case Uncle Dave shows up. And you and Scooby can spend the night on the boat to guard it in case the storm gets worse.
Can we just take a moment to appreciate exactly what Fred is saying here? While he and the girls are resting comfortably in a warm cabin sheltered from the elements, he's demanding Shaggy and Scooby spend the night huddled together in a cold boat while a storm rages. Worst friends ever. I would like to take a moment to thank my new Patreon members and apologize in advance if I mispronounce any names. Christopher Capasso. Thank you, Christopher Capasso. Nomad. Thank you, Nomad. Saxman8039. Thank you, Saxman8039. Thank you to everyone helping support my channel. It absolutely means the world to me. If you'd like to help, there's a link to my Patreon page below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. New members get a personal thank you in the next regular video I upload after they join, as well as credits in each regular video for as long as they remain a paid member. While out for a night of sailing, the gang run aground in the middle of the legendary Bermuda Triangle, where dozens of ships and planes have gone missing throughout the years. Thoughts of rescue are soon set aside when they realize that the mysterious island is not quite as deserted as they thought and could play a role in the earlier disappearance of a weather monitoring plane. Their investigation soon takes a sinister turn as they are chased by a trio of skeleton men, seemingly the pilots of the very same UFO responsible for the missing aircraft. It's a little vague, but I'm fairly certain Scooby was just struck by lightning. He's literally glowing. I'm sorry, but their boat should have smelled like the last Downer Party cookout just before they broke out the long pork. Scooby episodes were often a good indicator of what was popular in the 1970s, as they featured current celebrities at the time, Bigfoot, aliens, race cars, and Kiss. The franchise even explored disco, but as usual for Hanna-Barbera, right as the fad was beginning to fade. Here it's the Bermuda Triangle, and though its impact is likely lost on later generations catching this episode in syndication and streaming, for a kid like me growing up at the time, this episode would have caught my attention. The Bermuda Triangle mystery used to be huge and even played a role in a blockbuster Steven Spielberg movie the year before. Now, of course, it's pretty much accepted that ships and planes routinely get lost all over the world, and as a major shipping route travels through the Bermuda Triangle, it only makes sense that it would see its fair share of disappearances. But back then, many of us growing up felt real existential dread that we would somehow end up trapped in whatever otherworldly vortex or alien abduction plot that was centered on this stretch of ocean off the Florida coast.
Wow, look at those dark clouds.
A big storm's coming this way.
Right, Velma.
Big storm? The airplane at the beginning of the episode was there to monitor a hurricane. The gang are on a boat in the middle of the ocean in that same area. It's not like there wouldn't have been warnings that the weather was too dangerous to sail in. I think Fred just gets a huge kick out of putting everyone's lives in danger.
Come on, fellas. Do it for a Scooby snack?
Like, no way!
How about 2 Scooby snacks?
You guys are stranded on a deserted island in the middle of the ocean with no radio to call for help. Maybe you should be more careful when it comes to rationing out whatever food you brought with you. The mastermind of this episode's scheme was Dr. Grimsley, the head of Weather Eye, a monitoring station observing ocean storm activity. Along with 2 henchmen, he would steal airplanes used by his organization with the intention of selling them overseas. To disguise his involvement, Grimsley used a submarine equipped with a holographic projector to make it appear as though the missing planes were taken by a UFO, employing one of the theories surrounding the Bermuda Triangle. Grimsley managed to somehow install devices on the planes that would allow him to take remote control of the aircraft and land them on a nearby island equipped with an abandoned World War II airfield. Dressed as skeleton men, he and his henchmen would then tie up the pilots and lock them on their submarine. This is a really dumb one. Grimsley was essentially running a stolen automobile ring, except instead of a mass-produced product sold all over the world at prices the average consumer could afford, the villains here targeted expensive, highly specialized aircraft that would likely only be useful to a very limited number of governments or organizations that needed weather monitoring planes. These were not meant for passenger travel. These weren't even small planes for amateur pilots to enjoy an afternoon of pleasure flying. These were scientific planes filled with instruments meant to record weather data. They were also jet-propelled, which would require additional expensive maintenance costs. It's very difficult to pin down the value of the planes seen in the episode because it's difficult to even identify what kind of planes they were. If we assume we're dealing with modified military aircraft, the price would, of course, be much, much higher than a civilian counterpart. But that still doesn't get us any closer to the cost of one in the late 1970s when this episode was set. But is it even necessary to ascertain the monetary value of the aircraft? Because if we look at other clues, the real value of the scheme may not even be tied up in the supposed resale of the stolen planes. For starters, reselling this kind of equipment in the first place is ridiculous. The idea that there would be a market for stolen weather monitoring planes is laughable, as there's no civilian demand. It's not like major corporations are out there trying to corner the weather prediction market, nor would such a plane make for a nondescript means of transporting contraband by a criminal cartel. Thus, the only buyer for these planes would be another country for their own scientific research needs. I suspect Grimsley's entire plot was the work of a hostile foreign government killing two birds with one stone, bolstering their own weather monitoring stations for the home country, while at the same time weakening the United States' ability to do the same via sabotage.
Sabotage? How? When?
This idea is further supported by the equipment used by Grimsley and his men. Setting aside the incredibly sophisticated holographic projector and whatever hidden modifications were made on the stolen aircraft that allowed Grimsley to override the human pilots and land them on the island by remote control, the bad guys were using a military-grade submarine for their plot. As mentioned in a previous video, torpedoes are launched with a tremendous amount of pressure, and no human or dog could survive. We know this was a submarine that had to be part of some country's navy and not built for science or leisure dives, because there's a goddamn torpedo room armed with actual torpedoes. James Cameron doesn't have any of those with him when he visits the Titanic. Or maybe he does. By most accounts, he has a bit of a difficult personality.
An old man. Only one eye and a beard.
What did he say, Scoob?
Get off this island.
Scooby's doing charades again. What's up with that? He immediately uses English to let the rest know what the old man had said. What was the point of the charades?
This island is haunted. Take your boat and go while you still can.
We find out later that this old man is actually Commander Stern, a disguised naval officer investigating the island. It's the middle of a hurricane, and he saw their marooned boat, so he knew the teenagers had no way to leave the island safely. Why didn't he just radio for a rescue boat, or, better yet, just tell them about the investigation and order them to remain on the beach? By being sinister and vague, he just encouraged the gang to meddle. Something else to consider is how limited Grimsley's scheme would be if it really was just a simple plot involving reselling stolen planes. Automobiles are everywhere, which means thieves have essentially an unlimited supply of inventory. Weather planes are not nearly as prolific, and it's safe to say Weather Eye likely only had a handful of aircraft in the first place. In fact, it's possible the two stolen planes constituted the entirety of their fleet. The submarine, the holographic projector, the remote control equipment, the hidden island airstrip, these took a lot of time and money to implement just to steal 2 or 3 planes. It only makes sense that another country is meddling with ours, and Grimsley and his men were merely foreign operatives. Using that as the premise for their scheme, they get a design score of 4 out of 5. If they had been working for themselves, they'd have been lucky to score a 1. Remember when you were back in school and it was the day before a major paper was due, but instead of working on it, you had spent the previous week in your bedroom, hunched over your Commodore 64, using Gary Kitchen's Game Maker to painstakingly create what you thought was a hilarious animation of Pitfall Harry doing something pornographic? Oh, come on. It couldn't have been just me. Anyway, you ran out of time and at the last minute just threw whatever down on the page and hoped it would satisfy Mrs. Owens enough that she would at least give you a passing grade. That's what the Skeleton Men felt like to me. It seemed like the writers hit their deadline to turn in the script and didn't have enough time to come up with anything clever. First of all, they weren't original for the Scooby franchise. We can go all the way back to the second Don Knotts episode of the new Scooby-Doo movies to see something like this. Second, even setting aside whether a skeleton suit had been seen in the Scooby-Doo-universe before, it was still a lame design, bereft of any imagination. Third, the suits were extremely unconvincing and clearly just men wearing outfits. When revisited years later in the second live-action Scooby-Doo film, the skeleton men were depicted as they should have been. Actual walking skeletons, further demonstrating how terrible the outfits were when they originally appeared. Fourth, it was a pointless design. These guys were supposed to be aliens abducting weather planes. What do skeletons have to do with aliens? Why didn't they dress up as glowing green men or slobbering tentacle creatures from another world? Technically, their heads were just giant eyeballs, and their hands and feet were claws, so I suppose that's technically an alien design. But when a skeleton was used as an alien before, it was much, much more effective. Fifth, they weren't particularly scary. They growled a bit, but the eyes never blinked, nor were they exuding any sense of menace apart from whatever eeriness would be afforded by animated skeletons, which again was almost nil due to the poor design. Finally, there were no special effects used by Grimsley and his men. No glowing, no floating, no buzzing sound, no ray guns, nothing that would convince anyone these guys were anything but men in suits. In fact, the only positive thing that could be said about the skeleton men costumes was that they were able to be used underwater, which just goes to show they were literally no more than dive suits painted with bones. Grimsley and the others get a 1 out of 5 for their outfit score. I can't even say this score was deserved because my scale doesn't allow for awarding zeros. Ask yourself this question. What is the point of a Scooby villain's cover story? Why do they wear their disguises? Why do they jump through so many elaborate hoops just to commit a crime? In nearly every case, it's to either frighten off potential witnesses or to keep their identities hidden. Grimsley and his men struck while the airplanes were isolated in the middle of the ocean during a hurricane. They were then flown by remote control to an abandoned island airstrip where the pilots were kidnapped and the aircraft were repainted to sell overseas. Do you notice what's missing? If you said potential witnesses, give yourself a Scooby snack. The only ones who would see their abductors would be the pilots. If Grimsley and his men planned on merely detaining their victims long enough to scarper off with the stolen aircraft, that could explain the need for the UFO ruse. Upon release, the missing men would claim they had been attacked by a flying saucer and aliens. Except they were imprisoned on a military submarine, not an alien spaceship, thus completely debunking the UFO cover story. Aha, I hear you say in the comments. Grimsley needed to make the pilots think they were being abducted by a UFO because they would be speaking to base over the radio. While true, this was still unnecessary. The stolen airplanes were already modified to be flown to the island airstrip by remote control, so it would have been easy for Grimsley to also remotely disable the radio.
See anything unusual?
Nope, not a clue.
I wonder if the radio still works.
Good thinking, Daphne.
I mentioned before how the gang often ignore their circumstances when Fred or Velma are determined to solve a mystery. Usually it's when they're stranded by the mystery machine breaking down and they're more interested in walking through a haunted house or a graveyard instead of worrying about a way to get home. This quirk of their personality is on major display here when the teenagers are literally marooned on what appears to be a deserted island without a means to escape, and it was danger-prone Daphne who had to remind them about using a radio to call for help.
This is Weather Eye 1 calling Weather Base. Come in, please. Your planes didn't crash.
What?
They're here on Diablo Island.
I'll notify the authorities. Stay put until we get there.
Wait a minute. Dr. Grimsley's one of the skeleton men who were chasing Shaggy and Scooby just a couple of minutes ago. How in the hell is he back at the weather station control tower to respond to Fred's radio call? Instead of going through the hassle of the submarine hologram projector, fake UFO abduction, and skeleton men disguises, it would have been so much easier had Grimsley simply waited until the airplanes were in the middle of the ocean before remotely disabling the radio and flying the craft to the island base. His men could then comfortably wait there wearing simple masks, holding guns to force the captured pilots into a room in the tower where they would be locked in until the end. Obviously, the easiest and safest thing to do would have been for Grimsley's henchmen to kill the pilots and dump their bodies in the middle of the sea, but it would have been needlessly bloodthirsty and unnecessary. If the men escaped their prison, they were on an island in the middle of the ocean. They didn't have anywhere to go and would have been easily recaptured. Not to mention, if the Coast Guard was called in to search for the missing aircraft, there would have been the possibility of finding the bodies. Of course, the 4 captured pilots did outnumber the 3 skeleton men, Which brings up something that really bugs me about this episode. The fact that we only ever saw 3 villains.
Boy, oh boy, we're gonna have clam chowder.
At the very least, clam chowder requires either cream or tomato broth, not to mention other ingredients like celery, onions, or potatoes. All the boys are going to have are boiled clams, and without even any butter or garlic.
Here they come!
The hull of an average submarine is comprised of steel plates around 3 inches thick, and some even have 2 hulls. The boys fell with enough force to mold the bottom of the craft with their heads. Speaking of clam chowder, cartoon physics aside, the inside of that sub should have looked like someone spilled several gallons of Manhattan style. As discussed in an earlier video, submarines are exceedingly complicated vehicles to operate, requiring at minimum 1 or 2 dozen crewmen to keep afloat. Even in the Scooby-Doo universe, there was no way only 3 men could man a naval submarine. Of course, we do see exactly that, or at least we see the sub in operation. The only time we see inside is when it's docked, in which case there would be no need for a crew.
That's funny. It looks like somebody's repainting the plane.
Now this mystery is starting to make sense.
This is a common occurrence in the Scooby-Doo universe when the gang come across a half-painted stolen car or boat that clues them into whatever the villain's scheme is. I've sometimes wondered why the bad guys stop in the middle of the job. Well, while writing this script, I'm in the middle of repainting a house, and I can tell you, painting sucks, and you do often need to take some time off to rest. It's possible the rest of the crew was elsewhere on the island or had even been shuttled off to the mainland in another craft by the time the gang had arrived to investigate, leaving just Grimsley and the 2 henchmen we see. The fact that the flashback of the aircraft being painted features 2 men who were not the same ones in the Unmasking proves there were more involved. Don't forget that the aircraft would need to be transported off the island as well, which meant a cargo ship would be required, involving that many more crew members aware of the stolen goods. In fact, this hypothetical cargo ship could be where the crew of the submarine were located. It's possible the ship and crew were ordered off the island because the abandoned airfield didn't have adequate accommodations, or maybe it was just shore leave after 2 successful aircraft abductions. If they already needed a ship to transport the stolen airplanes, why did Grimsley and his men even bother with the submarine in the first place? They could have simply installed the holographic projector on their one ship and used it to fake the UFO. It's not like they needed to hide the vessel while at sea, considering the submarine had to surface in order to flash the holograph. Witnesses would have seen a sub just as easily as a ship. But at least this way, they didn't have to deal with the cost and hassle of a naval submarine.
Do something, Scooby!
Grimsley and his men also didn't do much to capture the teenagers. Sure, they chased them, but that was about it. They didn't even try killing the kids.
Let's look in here.
A dead end.
It's filling up with water.
Oh gosh, we're trapped.
At first I thought this might have been an attempt to murder Fred, Daphne, and Velma, except the skeleton men were nowhere near them. This was just the 3 kids bumbling into their own deaths. Between these 3 trapping themselves and Shaggy potentially killing Scooby by launching him out a torpedo tube, Grimsley and his henchmen could have just sat on the beach sipping margaritas while the potential witnesses took care of themselves. Also, what was the point of that room? I can understand an underwater airlock that fills with seawater to equalize pressure for divers about to leave a ship or a sub, but what would be the point of one of those on land?
We're doomed.
Somebody dropped us a rope.
The door didn't open by itself. And what about the ladder? Somebody saved us.
We learn later that Commander Stern had rescued the teenagers from their own stupidity by opening the hatch and dropping a rope ladder. This makes me wonder if he was the one who trapped them in the first place, just long enough to scare them away from meddling with his investigation. Otherwise, the poor guy is stuck not only trying to do his job looking for the missing planes, but also babysitting a group of teenagers too stupid to stay off the ocean during a hurricane. Grimsley and his men successfully stole 2 scientific aircraft and kidnapped the pilots. However, they failed to get those planes off the island, and they ruined their own cover story by locking their victims up in a submarine of obvious Earth technology. They also failed to keep the nosy teenagers from stumbling onto their island and didn't capture them either. They get a 2 out of 5 for their operation.
We figured you were the one who saved us from that flooding dry dock, Commander. Thanks.
And the Navy thanks all of you for solving this mystery.
I didn't want to be petty and spend a lot of time discussing the poor quality of the animation in this episode, but wow. Commander Stern here looks more like Hanover Fist. Grimsley and his 2 henchmen get a final due score of 2.3 out of 5.
Why, it's Dr. Grimsley, the head of the Weather Eye Project.
The hell with Dr. Grimsley? That's Carl the Stuntman! No wonder this plan failed. F***ing Carl the Stuntman.
Now what are you gonna give me?
Scooby-Doo!
Well, that was some casual cruelty. Look at that poor worm's face. And that's my ranking of the villains from the first set of episodes of the 3rd season of the Scooby-Doo Show, shown here. It's sad to say we seem to have gotten off to a poor start for the final season. I know there are some iconic villains coming up, but also some that look somewhat familiar. Here's hoping they get better. I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, there's a link to my Patreon below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. Patreon members receive credit in my videos for as long as they remain a paid member, as well as a personal shout out in the next regular video produced after they join. So, Harry from Arrow, did you watch this far?